Welcome everyone, Christine here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires, and to talk about the AI, the campaign AI to be specific. And I've already gone over what Creative Assembly has changed. In some ways they've made them more passive, in other ways they've made them more logical. In other ways they've also changed the faction potential. They've randomized that. So it used to be that I think certain specific factions would have a lot of faction potential, and thus those factions would end up being dominant on the campaign map, but now that has been randomized. So you won't see the same factions coming out on top, unless the geographic power they have, their lord power, their racial power is of such a nature that they're just going to overcome whatever challenges they have, at least in the early game. It's more of a late game benefit regardless though, but it certainly does change the campaign dynamic by quite a bit. Now, one of the complaints that people have had about the campaign AI is that it is way too passive since the patch. To that I would reply, if you find the AI too passive and you're dominating the campaign map, just increase the difficulty. If you haven't already. Like, if you're playing on a lower difficulty, increase it, you certainly will feel you will have a different experience, because the AI, the more you increase the difficulty, in terms of campaign, but also battle difficulty, it is going to behave differently. Also, I would like to note that right now you can certainly increase the difficulty of battles to very hard without the AI getting the stats modifier. So there's not as many reasons to keep the difficulty lower as they were before, because you no longer have to deal with the annoying, crappy leadership. Very hard battle difficulty does affect the auto-resolve, so you will fight more battles manually, but they're not necessarily going to be excruciatingly difficult. Although the AI will use better tactics, or should use better tactics in battle than before. That's one of the things I would mention. But to be sure, if you were already playing on Legendary very hard before, it does feel like the AI is more passive. This, to me, is not necessarily an issue until it becomes on. Like, there's pros and cons with the way the AI works. Overall, I think it is a better change. The reason it is a better change, while I understand some people live for the meme of difficulty, I think the way difficulty is handled is just as important. So just because a game is hard, quote-unquote hard, if you're telling me Warhammer 3 was hard before this change, if you're an experienced player on Legendary very hard, I'm sorry. That is kind of rubbish, honestly. I'm specifically talking about people who know what they were doing, who knew which buttons to press. It wasn't brutally difficult. There were certainly challenges, but it was exceptionally frustrating to, say, for instance, play campaign as Alariel in this case, and have like Ekeclaw declare war on you from across the damned ocean, invade Ulthuan, not that he would ever accomplish anything, but just because of AI aggression, especially AI aggression against the player. Now, the reason AI was aggressive towards the player is because the AI was seeing, the way I saw the situation, the AI was aggressive towards the player because the AI is always going to scan for threats and see where it can strike and where it cannot, and you always seem like an easier target because you have a less than stellar auto-resolve situation because of battle difficulty. Obviously, I'm making these videos accounting for Legendary very hard specifically. It always seemed like the player had the better chance because, yeah, your auto-resolve, you don't have the auto-resolve benefit that the AI does have. That may or may not have been toned down in the auto-resolve situation. I'm not sure if it has been changed or not. I think not. To some extent, I do notice a difference in auto-resolve, and I also notice a difference in how the AI is behaving because of auto-resolve. But the AI would just engage in really stupid tactics. Yes, it could hurt you a significant amount if the AI showed up and took out one of your key settlements, but the chances of you losing and the AI winning the war, so to speak, were very low with such tactics, because while taking out a portion of your economy can hurt, this is a game where you get a lot of resources from post-battle. So as long as your main army, which can be on the other side of the planet, as long as that's winning battles and gaining money, the chances of you losing a campaign are nil. Unless you're playing Chaos Dwarves, in which case you can absolutely lose a campaign if you lose critical points of the industry, which, by the way, makes the Chaos Dwarves more fun to play, because they have that vulnerability. But for most factions, for most Legendary Lords, that is highly unlikely, right? As long as you're aggressive, as long as you have the initiative, as long as you're pushing onward, it is extremely unlikely that you'll lose. It just was exceptionally frustrating to have to deal with that. Did it make the campaign harder? Well, in a way it did, because it forced you to spam recruit emergency armies to deal with some of those issues, and those battles could end up difficult because they were crap armies, ultimately crap lords. That could be difficult, but I personally think that's a question of difficulties for difficulty's sake, not the question of like good design, and that's what I think is more important. However, there is absolutely a problem with the way the AI behaves right now. It is better overall. Like overall, I would say the campaign flow, the campaign dynamic, especially if you're the kind of person already playing on Legendary very hard, is better. If you're playing on lower difficulty, then you have more reasons to increase it because you don't have the crap with AI aversion. You don't have the limitations there that you had before. You no longer have to deal with the level of frustration that you did have to deal with before. Again, some people are going to be like, it's easier, so it's worse, but not quite, right? That said, there are certainly problems because the AI is now acting in a more logical sense. For instance, let's take Tarax. Tarax, just to give you an idea, Tarax would end up dying in every campaign, virtually every campaign on Legendary before, just because while his army could auto-resolve against the Karen Carr and wipe them out, the problem that he would encounter later on is that, well, it will only work until as long as he fought opponents where he could just out-resolve his way to victory, but then he would encounter Sinnelleos and Alifanar, and then he'd just get wiped out, or the Sisters of Twilight would wipe him out, and he'd always lose that situation. Him being more passive actually makes him a bigger threat to deal with, because while certainly you can defeat his army relatively easily, at least you have to fight his army in the campaign, whereas before, even as Sinnelleos and Alifanar and Sisters, you may not have had much of an issue to deal with him. This also helps other factions that are far more powerful than the Beastmen and Outerzone, that's like the Wood Elves. One of the problems with Draika, for instance, does seem that she's lost, but one of the problems the Wood Elves have is that while the Wood Elves are very powerful if you play them, they're a joke in the hands of the AI. The reason they're a joke is that you just show up at their fancy trees, declare war on them, wipe them out, and they lose all their recruitment economy and they die. Even Draika, like that's the key of defeating Draika. You can still use it, but you're also going to encounter far more situations where the AI is going to defend those elements, where it's not going to run around like a scared cat from the threats, and it's actually going to properly defend its key elements. That said, there are limitations because the AI being more logical and not declaring war like that means that you have a lot more initiative and you can control the flow of battle, and you may not face any threat in the campaign whatsoever. You may face very little in terms of declarations of war, unless you make a faction hate you a significant amount. My personal thought on that matter is that the solution to that issue, and it is an issue, because let's say, for instance, campaign, Morafi's gonna die, I defeated one of her armies, lost one other to her, but it's like, Astankia is gonna wipe Morafi out here. And then, well, this doesn't matter, really. It's just the difference of, it's just the difference who gets this territory. Either me or Astankia could have gotten this territory. But it doesn't matter because Malekith doesn't care about what happens to Morafi. And no other factions care. Like, for instance, Alifanar, who is mortal enemies with the Dark Elves, is not my friend all of a sudden that I beat Morafi in a crucial battle. And I think that would be the solution. Now, it's kind of a variant of the Realm Divide, right? That we had in Shogun 2. Now, I've never been fond of those mechanics because I think just screwing you over in diplomacy globally is a really terrible mechanic. But on a more limited scale, it would make sense. So, for instance, let's say you're playing a campaign as Alariel, and you're fighting the Scourge of Cain, you're fighting Slaanesh. Well, then every faction that has a stake in Wolf 1, including Morafi and Malekith, want to go for it, should hate you for it. The High Elven factions you should get diplomatic benefits for it, make it easier to confederate, but the factions that ultimately want to conquer Wolf 1 and have it as a campaign objective, at least the ones that start in Wolf 1, should obviously have major diplomatic downsides that scale up the more damage you do to the factions they're allied with or could be allied with, and the friendlier you get with factions that they're at war with. This already happens, but it's far too limited, so that effect should be increased. And it also should be considered by a region level. Like the theaters that the Changeling use could be a great way of doing this, because like you could have, like, if you're fighting Wolf 1, then naturally you're going to piss off all of Wolf 1, but there's also the possibility of fighting only portions of Wolf 1, and when the other factions get involved, like let's say you declare war on Tyrion, by the time Alariel declares war on you, she would, assuming you haven't started a war with Alariel at the same time as Tyrion, But by the time Alariel might declare war on you, or Elfarion, it might be too late and you've gotten that foothold. So let's say you started a war with Tyrion and only Tyrion by manipulating diplomacy, then that just should cause a significant diplomatic penalty with, say, Alariel and Elfarion, because they're natural allies with Tyrion. Even if they don't have a military alliance, if they have a military alliance, the downside, the penalty in diplomacy should be accelerated, and it should also push the AI towards being more aggressive towards you in that context. Or say, for instance, you pick a fight to a Norsca, then that should limit your diplomacy and impact you severely with the warriors who cast. So, like, for instance, if you're playing Kislev and you're fighting one of the Norscan factions, then you're basically going to end up in a war with all of them. But at the same time, if you're fighting as Norsca and you're fighting Kislev, you should get the diplomatic benefit with your fellow faction, make it easier to confederate. Like, your natural allies should be your allies. Your enemies should be your enemies. So like it shouldn't be that, for instance, Alifanar can ally Malekith. Yes, you can actually do that. That's insane. It's territory trading. So I think like that kind of mechanic should be implemented where it makes sense, when it makes sense on a regional level. Like, for instance, if a faction like Valkia, who by the way in lore fought the Dark Elves, if Valkia is wiping out Helebron, then Malekith should take significant issue with that, for instance. That's just an idea. Now, of course, it will limit the sandbox potential, so how they would handle this, the exact specifics of this, would have to be debated to an extent or another and limited to one extent or another. But at the same time, I think that the solution to the problem is not making the AI stupidly aggressive as it before. Because, by the way, it would screw over the AI. Like, the AI empires would end up becoming very fragile just by them throwing endless armies against you and getting wiped out. Like, for instance, infamously, the most infamous example is like Warzag. If you're playing a campaign as Karakadrin, which, by the way, got wiped... not Karakadrin, Karazakarak, which got wiped out over here. But if you're playing a campaign as Forgrim, then you could funnel Warzag's armies into Barak Var, wipe them out, and you didn't even need to go wipe out the Warzag settlements, because since Warzag was being stupid and being very aggressive against you, then Queek would come in and wipe him out for you, or Malagor and Queek and Scarbrand potentially would come in and wipe him out. And that is absolutely an issue when the AI is just being really stupid about it. And it wasn't just stupid towards you as the player, it was also stupid against one another. Like, I've seen so many AI factions and campaigns in Immortal Empires get wiped out because they committed to one enemy, didn't defend their backside, another faction declared war on them, they still didn't defend their backside, and they got wiped out. Or hell, I've even seen it in Ulfan over here, because what Elfarion tends to do in the campaign is that he marches his army south, right? And that's where he kind of stops until he ends up at war with Nakari. Let's say you're playing Nakari, you wipe out Katik, that should piss off Elfarion, and he should view you as a threat. But what would happen, you would eventually piss off Elfarion, but it was very possible to wipe out Tor of Rest as Nakari, or for Nakari in general, even under AI control, to wipe out Tor of Rest, because Elfarion's armies under AI control would end up over here in Southern of Rest, so Tor of Rest would basically be undefended. And that, as a result of that, he would lose a good chunk of territory. He would eventually win, sure, but this is how you won as Nakari. You took advantage of the system as it existed, let alone the system as it exists right now, to really wipe out a lot of factions by those kind of declarations of war. So I think some kind of system where the AI is taking notice of what you're doing on the campaign map, and it shouldn't be just like based, oh, you're very strong. No, it should be like, what territory are you controlling? How important is that territory? Oh, am I bordering this faction, for instance? The AI should ask itself, like, is that faction coming towards me? Are they killing my friends? Are they taking territory I want to take? Now, to an extent, this already happens, but I think that needs to be greatly accelerated so that you have more conflict, not just between the player and the AI, but between various AI factions, instead of a lot of passive action on the campaign map. And a lot of less stupidity, by the way, when it comes to AI behavior, because right now it just kind of feels like a roll of the dice sometimes, or a lot of times when the AI declares war, let alone on you, or on fellow AI factions, let alone on you as the player. And I think that kind of behavior should be stomped out. Costin here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.